The clock on the wall showed 6:30 in the evening as David finished wiping down the last set of lockers in the school hallway. His worn-out sneakers squeaked softly against the freshly mopped floor as he pushed his cleaning cart down the empty corridor. The afternoon sun was setting through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the walls lined with colorful student artwork and achievement certificates. David had been doing this same routine for 3 years now. Every weekday, after the last school bell rang and the children rushed out to their waiting parents, he would begin his quiet work of cleaning Lincoln Elementary School. Room by room, hallway by hallway, he made sure everything was spotless for the next day's learning. At 34 years old, David never imagined his life would look like this. But life has a way of surprising people, doesn't it? Sometimes it throws curveballs that change everything in ways we never expected. 3 years ago, when his wife passed away after a long battle with illness, David found himself alone with his 8-year-old daughter. The medical bills had eaten up most of their savings, and his previous career became impossible to maintain while being a single parent. The custodian job at the elementary school was perfect in many ways. It paid enough to cover their basic needs. The hours worked well with his daughter's school schedule, and most importantly, it let him be nearby if she ever needed him. The principal had been understanding about letting his daughter stay in an empty classroom while he worked, doing her homework and reading books until they could go home together. As David pushed his cart past the main office, he could hear the familiar sound of his daughter's pencil scratching against paper. Through the open door of classroom 3B, he could see her bent over her math homework, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration the way she always did when working on something challenging. Her backpack sat beside her on the floor, decorated with patches from various places they had visited during happier times. "How's the homework coming along, sweetheart?" David called out softly. "Almost done, Dad," she replied without looking up. "Just 2 more word problems and then I can read my library book." David smiled and continued down the hallway. His daughter was such a good kid. She never complained about having to stay late at school while he worked. She never asked why they couldn't afford the after-school programs that her classmates attended. She just accepted their situation with the kind of grace that sometimes amazed him. Kids are more resilient than adults give them credit for, but David still worried about her missing out on things that other children took for granted. Tonight's cleaning route would take him through the cafeteria, the gymnasium, and finally the music room. The music room was always his last stop because it was the quietest part of the building, and his daughter could pack up her things without disturbing anyone. Plus, if he was being honest with himself, there was something peaceful about ending his workday in that particular room. The cafeteria cleaning went quickly. David had developed an efficient system over the years. First, he would sweep under all the tables and benches, collecting the usual assortment of dropped food, forgotten pencils, and the occasional toy that had fallen from someone's pocket. Then he would mop the entire floor, working his way from the far end toward the exit so he wouldn't step on the clean areas. As he worked, David thought about the conversation he had overheard earlier between 2 teachers discussing the upcoming spring fundraising event. The school was trying to raise money for the arts program, which was facing budget cuts. It made him sad to think that children might lose access to music and art classes. Those subjects had been so important to him when he was younger, though. That felt like a lifetime ago now. The gymnasium was next on his list. David enjoyed cleaning the gym because it reminded him of being active and healthy. He made sure to properly clean the basketball hoops, sweep the entire floor, and organize any equipment that had been left out. Sometimes he would take a moment to shoot an imaginary free throw, just to remember what it felt like to play sports without a care in the world. Finally, it was time for the music room. David always saved this room for last, not just because of its location, but because there was something special about it. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light filtered through the windows. Or maybe it was the peaceful quiet that settled over this part of the building after everyone went home. As he pushed open the door to the music room, David noticed something different tonight. The large black grand piano in the center of the room was uncovered. Usually Mrs. Wilson, the music teacher, kept it protected with a heavy cloth cover, but today she must have forgotten after the afternoon's concert rehearsal with the 5th grade. Students. David had seen this piano hundreds of times over the past 3 years, but tonight something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the evening light fell across the polished black surface, or maybe it was just that seeing it uncovered made it look more like an actual instrument. Instead of just another piece of furniture to clean around, he began his usual routine, sweeping around the piano bench and wiping down the music stands that were scattered around the room. Sheet music was spread across several stands left behind from the day's practice session. David couldn't help but glance at the notes and symbols, even though it had been years since he had really looked at written music. As he dusted the piano bench, something stirred deep in his memory. His fingers paused on the smooth wooden surface, and for just a moment he could almost hear music in the silence. Not the cheerful children's songs that usually filled this room during school hours, but something deeper, more complex, more emotional. David shook his head and continued cleaning. This wasn't the time for getting lost in old memories. He had work to finish and a daughter waiting for him. But as he wiped down the piano surface, being careful not to touch the keys, he couldn't shake the feeling that this instrument was somehow calling to him. "Dad, are you almost done?" His daughter's voice came from the doorway, breaking him out of his thoughts. "Just finishing up in here," David replied, quickly completing his cleaning routine. "Did you finish all your homework?" "Yep, and I read 2 chapters of my book, too," she said proudly. Holding up the novel she had checked out from the school library, David packed up his cleaning supplies and pushed the cart toward the door. But as they prepared to leave, his daughter stopped and looked back at the piano. "Dad, do you know how to play that?" she asked, pointing at the gleaming instrument. The question caught David off guard. His daughter had never asked him about music. Before, he looked at the piano, then back at her curious face, and felt something tighten in his chest. "A little bit," he said quietly. "I used to play when I was younger." "Could you play something for me sometime?" she asked with the innocent hope that only children possess. David's heart ached a little at her request. "Maybe someday, sweetheart. Maybe someday." As they walked out of the school together, David carrying his daughter's backpack and his cleaning supplies, he couldn't stop thinking about that piano and the way his daughter had looked at it with such wonder. Some doors from the past are easier to keep closed, but tonight, one of those doors had been nudged open just a crack. The next evening, David found himself moving slower than usual as he approached the music room. All day long, he couldn't stop thinking about his daughter's question from the night before. "Do you know how to play that?" Her innocent words had stirred something inside him that he had buried deep for years. As he pushed his cleaning cart down the familiar hallway, memories began flooding back like water breaking through a dam. He remembered sitting at a different piano in a different time, when his biggest worry was perfecting a difficult passage in a classical piece. Back then, his hands had been smooth and precise, not rough and calloused from years of manual labor. David entered the music room and saw that Mrs. Wilson had once again left the piano uncovered. Maybe she was getting forgetful, or maybe she was just busy with all the spring concert preparations. Either way, there it sat, gleaming black and beautiful under the fluorescent lights. As he began dusting around the instrument, David's mind drifted back 15 years. He had been 19 then, a sophomore at the State University with dreams bigger than his small hometown. His professor had just told him that he had real talent, the kind that could take him places. "You have something special," she had said after he finished playing a challenging piece by Chopin. "With dedication and the right opportunities, you could audition for professional orchestras." Those words had filled him with such hope and excitement. David had rushed home to his tiny apartment and called his girlfriend, the woman who would later become his wife. She had been so proud of him, so supportive of his dreams. They would spend hours talking about the future, about him playing in concert halls while she sat in the front row, beaming with pride. But life had other plans. David ran his cleaning cloth along the piano bench, remembering how he used to sit for hours practicing scales and arpeggios until his fingers ached. He had been disciplined then, focused, willing to sacrifice social activities and leisure time for the chance to perfect his craft. His dorm room neighbors had complained about the constant piano music coming from the practice rooms, but David hadn't cared. Music was his world, his passion, his future. The memory of his wife's laugh suddenly filled his mind. She used to joke that she fell in love with him because of the way he played piano. "Your fingers tell stories," she would say, watching him. "Practice. I can hear your heart in every note." She had this way of sitting quietly while he played, never interrupting, just listening with a smile on her face that made him feel like the most talented person in the world. David paused in his cleaning and looked at his hands. They were so different now. Rough skin, short nails, small cuts and calluses from years of handling cleaning supplies and equipment. These weren't the hands of a pianist anymore. These were the hands of a working man, a father doing whatever it took to provide for his child. The change hadn't happened overnight. When his wife got pregnant in their senior year of college, they had to make difficult decisions. David dropped his music major and switched to something more practical, something that would help him support a family. He told himself it was temporary, that he would return to music once they were stable. Then came the sleepless nights with a newborn baby. Between diaper changes and feeding schedules, there was no time for practice. The piano in their small apartment gathered dust while David worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for baby supplies and rent. His wife tried to encourage him to play, even for just a few minutes each day, but exhaustion won out over passion. "Maybe when she's older," David would say, looking at their beautiful daughter sleeping peacefully in her crib. "When things settle down, I'll get back to it." But things never really settled down. As their daughter grew, there were different challenges. Preschool costs, doctor visits, clothes that needed replacing every few months as she outgrew them. The piano eventually had to be sold to help pay for their daughter's daycare so both parents could work full-time. David remembered the day they moved that piano out of their apartment. He had stood in the doorway watching the movers carry away the instrument that had been such a huge part of his identity. His wife had squeezed his hand and whispered, "We'll get another one someday." He had nodded and smiled, but deep down, he knew that someday might never come. Then his wife got sick. David stopped cleaning and sat down on the piano bench, overwhelmed by the weight of his memories. The illness had come suddenly, aggressively. First, there were the doctor visits that revealed the devastating diagnosis. Then came the treatments, the hospital stays, the medical bills that piled up faster than their insurance could cover them. During those difficult months, David had sometimes thought about music as an escape from the harsh reality of their situation. But there was no time for thinking about the past when the present demanded everything he had. His wife needed him. His daughter needed him. Music felt like a luxury they couldn't afford, emotionally or financially. The last conversation he had with his wife about music still played in his mind like a favorite song. She was lying in the hospital bed, weak, but still trying to smile for him and their daughter. "Promise me something?" she had whispered when their daughter was down the hall getting a snack from the vending machine. "Promise me you'll play again. Someday, your music was too beautiful to lose forever." David had promised, thinking she meant after she got better. But she never got better. After the funeral, after the final medical bills were paid, after their savings account was completely empty, David had to find a way to start over. The university music degree felt useless in the face of real-world responsibilities. He needed steady income, health insurance, and a job that would let him be there for his daughter, who had already lost so much. The custodian position at the elementary school had been a godsend. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what he had dreamed of doing with his life, but it provided stability. More importantly, it allowed him to be the kind of present, reliable father his daughter needed during such a difficult time. David stood up from the piano bench and resumed his cleaning. 3 years had passed since then, and he had gotten good at not thinking about the music he used to make. He had trained himself to focus on the here and now, on being practical and responsible. Dreams were for people who had the luxury of taking risks, but sitting at that piano bench, even for just a moment, had awakened something in him that he thought was gone forever. His fingers had remembered the weight of piano keys, the resistance and responsiveness that was so familiar once upon a time. For just a second he had felt like his old self again. "Dad?" His daughter appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over her shoulder and library book tucked under her arm. "You're taking longer tonight. Is everything okay?" David quickly finished wiping down the piano and gathered his cleaning supplies. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just making sure everything is extra clean for tomorrow." As they walked toward the exit, his daughter surprised him by asking, "Dad, when you were younger and played piano, were you good at it?" The question stopped David in his tracks. How could he explain to his 8-year-old daughter that music had once been his whole world? How could he tell her about dreams that had been set aside for more important things, like keeping their small family together? "I practiced a lot," he said carefully. "I loved playing very much." "Why did you stop?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. David looked down at his daughter's curious face and felt his heart ache with both love and regret. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean the love for something ever really goes away." His daughter nodded as if she understood, even though David knew she was too young to grasp the weight of such sacrifices. As they walked to their car in the parking lot, David found himself wondering if his wife's promise still mattered after all these years, and whether it was possible to find your way back to something you thought you had lost forever. The following evening, David was running a few minutes behind schedule. One of the second-grade classrooms had experienced what teachers politely called an incident, involving spilled paint and enthusiastic young artists. It had taken extra time to clean the colorful mess from the floor, desks, and somehow even the ceiling. Kids have an amazing ability to get art supplies in places that seem physically impossible. By the time David reached the music room, the sun was already setting, casting longer shadows through the windows than usual. His daughter was waiting patiently in classroom 3B, probably wondering why he was taking so long tonight. He made a mental note to apologize and maybe stop by the vending machine to get her a small treat on their way out. As David pushed open the door to the music room, he immediately noticed that the piano was uncovered again. But tonight, there was something else that caught his attention. Sitting on top of the gleaming black surface was a stack of papers that definitely hadn't been there the night before. David approached the piano with his cleaning supplies, and as he got closer, he could see that the papers were programs. Fancy, printed programs with elegant gold lettering. The top page read, "Lincoln Elementary Spring Fundraising Gala." With a date just 3 weeks away, curiosity got the better of him. David set down his spray bottle and picked up one of the programs to take a closer look. The event was scheduled for Friday evening and promised an evening of music, art, and community spirit. The goal, according to the introduction, was to raise money for the school's arts program, which was facing significant budget cuts due to recent district-wide financial constraints. David's heart sank a little as he read about the budget cuts. He knew how much the children loved their music and art classes. During his cleaning rounds, he often saw the joy on students' faces as they left the music room, humming songs they had just learned or excitedly discussing the instruments they had tried that day. The thought of those opportunities being taken away felt wrong. As he flipped through the program, David saw a schedule of planned performances. There would be a children's choir singing popular songs from recent movies. The 4th-grade class was going to perform a short play they had written themselves. Several parents had volunteered to showcase various talents, from magic tricks to poetry readings, but it was one particular section that made David stop breathing for a moment. Under the heading Classical Music Segment, there was a line that read Piano Performance, to be announced. Below that, in smaller print, it said, Originally scheduled performer unavailable due to scheduling conflict. We are currently seeking a replacement to fill this important slot in our program. David read those lines 3 times, making sure he understood correctly. Someone was supposed to play classical piano at this fundraising event, but they had backed out. The school was looking for someone else to take their place. His hands began to tremble slightly as he held the program. Without Thinking, he sat down on the piano bench, still staring at the words on the page. The classical music segment was supposed to be one of the highlights of the evening, designed to showcase the sophistication and cultural value of the arts program the school was trying to save. David's mind began racing. He thought about his conversation with his daughter 2 nights ago when she had asked if he could play piano. He thought about his wife's final request for him to return to music someday. He thought about all those years of training and practice that were still buried somewhere inside him, waiting to be rediscovered, but then reality crept back in and David shook his head. What was he thinking? He was the school custodian, not a performer. These fundraising events were for parents and community members who had money to donate and social status to maintain. He was just the guy who cleaned up after everyone. Went home. David stood up from the bench and set the program back on the piano. He needed to focus on his work and stop getting distracted by impossible ideas. But as he began cleaning around the instrument, he couldn't stop thinking about that empty slot in the program. The more he thought about it, the more the situation bothered him. This wasn't just about one missing performance. The entire arts program was in jeopardy and every part of the fundraising event mattered. If the classical music segment was canceled or poorly received, it could affect how much money they raised. And if they didn't raise enough money, children would lose access to something that could change their lives. The way music had once changed his. David found himself looking at his hands again as he wiped down the piano keys. These hands had once been capable of bringing beautiful music to life. They had spent thousands of hours learning to move with precision and grace across piano keys just like these. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of different work, but still there. As he cleaned, David began to imagine what it would feel like to sit at this piano, not as a custodian, but as a musician. He pictured his fingers finding their way to familiar melodies, his hands remembering the weight and resistance of the keys. For just a moment, he allowed himself to wonder if he could still play the pieces he had memorized so many years ago. "Dad, are you okay in there?" His daughter's voice echoed from the hallway. "Coming, sweetheart," David called back, quickly finishing his cleaning routine. But as he packed up his supplies, his daughter appeared in the doorway. She looked at the piano, then at her father, and tilted her head with curiosity. "What are those papers?" she asked, pointing to the program still sitting on the piano. "Just some information about a school event," David replied, trying to sound casual. His daughter walked over to the piano and picked up one of the programs. Even though she was only 8 years old, she was a good reader, and David watched as her eyes scanned the pages. "Dad, look," she said excitedly, pointing to the classical music section. "They need someone to play piano at this fancy party. You could do that." David's heart stopped. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple. This is a big event with important people. They need someone professional, someone experienced." "But you are experienced," his daughter said with the logical thinking that children excel at. "You told me you used to play piano when you were younger. And you said you practiced a lot." David knelt down to his daughter's eye level. "That was a long time ago, honey. I haven't played in years. I probably wouldn't even remember how to play a whole song anymore." His daughter looked at him with those big, trusting eyes that always made him want to be better than he thought he could be. "Maybe you could try, just to see if you remember?" The innocence of her suggestion hit David like a wave. She didn't see all the complicated social and economic barriers that he was worried about. She didn't think about the difference between a custodian and the type of person who usually performed at fundraising galas. To her, it was simple. The school needed someone to play piano, and her dad knew how to play piano. "I don't know, sweetheart," David said softly. "It's been so long, but what if you're still good at it?" she asked. "What if you could help save the music classes for all the kids at school?" That question hit David harder than he expected. His daughter had just connected something that he hadn't fully considered. This wasn't just about him playing piano again. This was about helping preserve something valuable for other children. Children who might discover the same love for music that had once meant everything to him. As they walked out of the school, Together that night, David carried the image of that program in his mind. He thought about the empty slot waiting to be filled, about his daughter's faith in his abilities, and about his wife's final wish for him to return to music someday. Maybe, just maybe, someday had finally arrived. That night, dinner was quieter than usual in their small apartment. David had picked up their regular meal from the local diner, nothing fancy, just the kind of simple food that filled their stomachs without breaking their tight budget. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup had become a weekly tradition, partly because his daughter loved it and partly because it was affordable comfort food. Their apartment wasn't much to look at. The furniture was a mix of second-hand finds and pieces that had survived their move from the bigger place they used to call home. The walls needed a fresh coat of paint, and the carpet had seen better days, but David had worked hard to make it feel warm and safe for his daughter. Family photos lined the shelves, and her artwork from school decorated the refrigerator like colorful magnets of joy. They ate. David found his mind wandering back to that program sitting on the piano at school. He kept thinking about the empty slot for the classical music performance and his daughter's simple suggestion that he could fill it. The idea seemed both impossible and strangely appealing at the same time. His daughter was unusually quiet too, which was rare for her. Normally, dinner time was when she would tell him about everything that had happened at school that day. She would describe which books she had read during silent reading time, what they had learned in science class, or which friends she had played with during recess. Tonight, though, she seemed lost in her own thoughts. Finally, she looked up from her soup and asked the question that had clearly been building in her mind all evening. "Dad, when you played piano before, what kind of music did you play?" David paused with his sandwich halfway to his mouth. He hadn't expected her to keep thinking about their conversation from the music room. Kids usually moved on to other topics pretty quickly, but something about this seemed to have captured her imagination. "Well," David said, setting down his food and really considering the question, "I played all different kinds of music when I was learning. But my favorite was classical music. You know, the kind that orchestras play in big concert halls." His daughter's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Like the music in movies when something really important is happening?" David smiled. "That was actually a pretty good way to describe it." "Yes, exactly like that. Classical music tells stories without using any words. It can make you feel happy or sad or excited just by the way the notes are arranged." "Can you tell me about a song you used to play?" she asked, abandoning her soup completely now that the conversation had gotten interesting. David felt a warmth spread through his chest. No one had asked him about his music in years. For a moment, he let himself remember one of his favorite pieces. "There was this one piece I loved to play. It was written by a composer named Chopin, and it was called a nocturne. That's a fancy word that means night music. It was gentle and beautiful, like a lullaby for grown-ups. When I played it, I used to think about peaceful things like stars in the sky or the sound of rain on windows." His daughter listened with complete attention. "The way children do when they're hearing something that truly captures their imagination." "It sounds pretty," she said softly. "Do you think you could still play it?" There it was again, that simple, innocent question that somehow cut right to the heart of everything David had been thinking about. "Do you think you could still play it?" "I don't know, sweetheart," David answered honestly. "It's been a very long time. Playing piano is like riding a bike in some ways. You don't completely forget how to do it. But it's also like being an athlete. If you don't practice for a long time, your muscles forget how to do the hard parts." His daughter nodded thoughtfully, processing this information. Then she asked something that completely caught David off guard. "Dad, why did you stop playing? Did you get tired of it?" David felt his throat tighten. How could he explain to his 8-year-old daughter the complex web of circumstances that had led him away from music? How could he tell her about the choices adults sometimes have to make when life gets complicated? "No, honey, I never got tired of it," David said carefully. "I stopped because other things became more important. When your mom and I had you, we needed to focus on taking care of our family. And then when Mom got sick, I needed to spend all my time helping. her get better and making sure you were okay? His daughter was quiet for a moment, and David could see her trying to understand. She had been only 5 when her mother died, old enough to remember, but too young to fully grasp everything that had happened. "But Mom isn't sick anymore," she said finally, with the straightforward logic that children excel at. "And I'm okay now, so maybe you could play again." The simplicity of her reasoning was both heartbreaking and beautiful. In her mind, the obstacles that had kept her father from music were no longer there, so returning to it should be possible. She couldn't see all the other barriers, the fear, the self-doubt, the years of distance from something he had once loved so much. "Maybe," David said softly, not wanting to crush her hope, but also not wanting to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I think you should try," his daughter said with the confidence that only comes from absolute faith in someone. "You love. I bet you're still really good at it. And I bet if you played that night music song, it would make people feel happy." David looked at his daughter's earnest face and felt something shift inside him. She believed in him with such pure, uncomplicated certainty. She didn't worry about whether he was good enough or whether people would judge him. She just knew that her dad had once been able to create beautiful music, and in her world, that meant he could probably do it again. "You know what?" David said, surprising himself with what he was about to suggest. "Maybe tomorrow night, after I finish cleaning the school, I could sit at the piano for just a few minutes. Just to see if I remember anything." His daughter's face broke into the biggest smile he had seen from her in weeks. "Really? Can I listen?" "Of course you can listen," David said, already wondering if he was making a mistake but unable to resist her enthusiasm. "But don't expect too much, okay? I might be really rusty." "I don't care if you're rusty," she said, bouncing a little in her chair. "I just want to hear what piano music sounds like when you play it." As they finished their dinner and moved on to her homework time, David found himself thinking about tomorrow evening with a mixture of excitement and terror. It had been so long since he had touched piano keys with the intention of making music rather than just cleaning around them. But his daughter's faith in him was infectious. Maybe she was right. Maybe the passage of time didn't have to mean the end of everything he had once been good at. Maybe, just maybe, some part of his musical self was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. That night, as David tucked his daughter into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and said, "Dad, I'm really excited about tomorrow." "Me too, sweetheart," David replied, and realized that for the first time in years he actually meant it. "Me too." As he turned off her light and closed her bedroom door, David found himself humming softly under his breath. It was just a simple melody, nothing fancy or complicated. But it was music, and it was coming from somewhere deep inside him that he had almost forgotten existed. Tomorrow, he would find out if that place was still real, or if it had been just a beautiful memory. All along, David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see himself sitting at the piano in the music room, his daughter watching with hopeful eyes. But in his mind, when he tried to place his fingers on the keys, nothing happened. No music came out, just the hollow sound of someone who had forgotten how to create beauty by morning. David had convinced himself that the whole idea was foolish. What had he been thinking? He was a custodian, not a performer. During his regular morning routine of getting his daughter ready for school, he almost decided to forget the entire conversation from the night before, but his daughter had other plans. "Dad, I can't wait for tonight," she said excitedly as she ate her cereal. "I've been thinking about what that night music might sound like all morning." David's heart sank. She had been looking forward to this, and now he was having second thoughts. He couldn't bear the idea of disappointing her, but he also couldn't shake the fear that he would embarrass himself and crush her faith in him. The day passed slowly at the school. David went through his usual cleaning routine, but his mind kept wandering to the evening ahead. Every time he passed by the music room during his daytime maintenance rounds, his stomach would flutter with nervous energy. Around lunchtime, David found himself standing outside the principal's office. Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman, who had always treated him with respect and appreciation for his work. She had been the one to hire him 3 years ago when he desperately needed a stable job. And she had been understanding about his daughter staying after school. David stood there for nearly 10 minutes, building up the courage to knock on her door. Several times he turned to walk away, telling himself this was a crazy idea. But something kept pulling him back. Finally, he knocked softly on the door frame. "Come in," Mrs. Henderson called from inside her office. David stepped inside, his hands slightly trembling. The principal looked up from the paperwork on her desk and smiled warmly. "David, what can I do for you? Is everything all right with your daughter?" "She's fine, thank you," David said, suddenly unsure how to begin. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else, something that might sound a little strange." Mrs. Henderson gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. What's on your mind?" David perched on the edge of the chair, feeling completely out of place in the administrative office. "I saw the program for the fundraising gala in the music room yesterday. I noticed that you're looking for someone to fill the classical piano spot." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows raised slightly. "Yes, unfortunately, our original performer had to cancel due to a family emergency. We're still trying to find a replacement, but it's been challenging on such short notice. Most of the local musicians who would be appropriate for the event already have commitments." David took a deep breath. "I know this might sound unusual, but I'd like to offer to fill that spot." For a moment, Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Are you suggesting someone you know?" "No," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm suggesting myself." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. David could see Mrs. Henderson trying to process what he had just said. He knew how it must sound, the school custodian offering to perform at a formal fundraising event. "David," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "I had no idea you played piano. Do you have musical training?" This was the moment David had been dreading. How could he explain his background without sounding like he was making it up or trying to be something he wasn't? "I studied piano in college," David said quietly. "I was actually a music major for several years before I switched to something more practical. I haven't played in a long time, but I used to be. Well, I used to be pretty good." Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, clearly surprised by this revelation. "David, I have to admit, this is unexpected. Can you tell me more about your experience?" David felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he forced himself to continue. "I studied classical piano for about 8 years total. I performed in several recitals and competitions when I was younger. My professor said I had potential to audition for professional orchestras, but life took me in a different direction." "What happened?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "My wife got pregnant during our senior year," David explained. "We needed stable income, so I changed my major to something that would help me support a family. Then, when my wife got sick a few years later, music just, it wasn't a priority anymore." Mrs. Henderson nodded with understanding. She had been at the school when David was hired and knew about his circumstances. "David, I'm touched that you would offer to help," she said. "But I have to ask, if you haven't played in years, do you feel confident about performing at such an important event? This gala is crucial for our arts program funding." That was the question David had been asking himself all day. "Honestly, I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like permission to use the music room after hours to practice, just to see if I can still do it. If I can't play well enough, I'll withdraw the offer, but if I can ... if you can." Mrs. Henderson prompted. "If I can, then maybe I can help save something that's important for the kids here. Music education meant everything to me when I was young. If there's any chance I can help preserve that for other children, I think I have to try." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face. Finally, she spoke. "You know, David, in all my years as an educator, I've learned that some of the most meaningful contributions come from the most unexpected places. You've been a dedicated member of our school community for 3 years. You care about this place and these children. If you think you can do this, then I'm willing to give you the chance." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. Really, Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. I'll arrange for you to have access to the music room after your regular work. Hours. How much time do you think you'll need to prepare? The gala is in 3 weeks, David said, his mind already calculating. If I practice every evening, that should be enough time to prepare 1 or 2 pieces, assuming I can still remember how to play. Perfect, Mrs. Henderson said, standing up from her desk. David, I have to say, I'm impressed by your willingness to step up like this. It takes courage to put yourself out there, especially when you haven't performed in years. As David walked back to his cleaning cart, he felt like he was in a dream. Had he really just volunteered to perform at the school's most important fundraising event? Had Mrs. Henderson really said yes? That evening, when he told his daughter what had happened, her reaction was everything he had hoped for and more. Dad, that's amazing, she practically shouted, throwing her arms around his neck. You're going to play piano for everyone at the fancy party. Well, first I have to remember how to play, David said, trying to manage her expectations. Tonight we'll find out if I can still do it. As they walked into the music room that evening, David felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. After years of cleaning around this piano, he was finally going to sit down and try to make music with it. His daughter settled cross-legged on the floor nearby, looking at him with such confidence and excitement that David almost forgot to be. Nervous. Almost. David sat down on the piano bench, adjusted the height, and placed his hands above the keys. For a moment he just sat there, remembering what it felt like to be a musician instead of just someone who cleaned up after everyone. Then, slowly, he pressed his fingers down and began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were shaky and uncertain. David's fingers felt clumsy on the keys, like they belonged to someone else. The simple scale he attempted sounded rough and uneven, nothing like the smooth, flowing music he remembered being able to create years ago. His daughter, sitting on the floor with her legs crossed, watched with wide eyes full of wonder. To her, this was magic happening right in front of her. She had never heard her father play anything before, so even these hesitant first attempts sounded amazing to her young ears. "That's so cool, Dad," she whispered, not wanting to interrupt but unable to contain her excitement. David tried a few more scales, then attempted a simple melody he remembered from his early lessons. His left hand struggled to remember the basic chord progressions while his right hand picked out the tune. It was frustrating and humbling at the same time. The music in his head was so much more beautiful than what was coming out of the piano. But something interesting happened as the minutes passed. Slowly, like a door creaking open after being locked for years, his muscle memory began to return. His fingers started to find their way around the keyboard with a little more confidence. The notes began to flow together more smoothly. After about 20 minutes of practice, David decided to attempt something more challenging. He closed his eyes and let his hands find the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece he had told his daughter about during dinner. It was the same piece he used to play for his wife when they were young and full of dreams about the future. The first few measures were rough, but as David continued, something beautiful began to happen. The melody started to sing, soft and gentle, filling the empty music room with the kind of beauty that makes people stop and listen. His daughter sat completely still, mesmerized by the transformation taking place before her eyes. As the last notes faded away, the room fell silent. David sat with his hands still on the keys, hardly believing what had just happened. The music hadn't been perfect. There were wrong notes and hesitations, but it had been real music. It had been beautiful. "Dad," his daughter said in a voice filled with awe, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." David turned to look at her and saw tears in her eyes. In that moment, he realized that music really could touch people's hearts, even when it wasn't performed perfectly. His daughter had been moved, not just by the notes he played, but by witnessing her father reconnect with something he loved. From that night forward, David began practicing every evening after finishing his custodial work. His daughter would do her homework at one of the desks in the music room, occasionally looking up to watch her father work through scales, exercises, and slowly, full pieces of music. The first week was the hardest. David's fingers ached from the unaccustomed movement, and his timing was often off. There were moments when he wanted to give up, convinced that he was fooling himself into thinking he could really do this. The fundraising gala wasn't just any small event. It was the school's biggest social gathering of the year, attended by parents, teachers, school board members, and important people from the community. But his daughter's unwavering faith kept him going. Every evening she would settle into her spot on the floor and listen with complete attention as he practiced. She never complained when he played the same passage over and over, trying to get it right. She never seemed bored, even when he spent 20 minutes just working on scales and finger exercises. "You're getting better every day," she would tell him as they walked to the car after practice. And slowly, David began to believe she was right. By the second week, his confidence was growing. The Chopin Nocturne was sounding more like music and less like a struggle. He had also chosen a second piece, a gentle waltz that would showcase a different side of his playing. His hands were remembering not just the notes, but the feeling of making music, the joy of bringing beautiful sounds to life. But with growing confidence came growing anxiety about the actual performance. David had never played for an audience like the one that would attend the gala. In college, his recitals had been attended mostly by other music students and professors, people who understood the technical challenges and appreciated the effort involved in learning. Difficult pieces, the gala audience would be different. These would be successful community members, many of whom had probably attended professional concerts at the city's Symphony Hall. They would have high expectations and refined musical tastes. What if his playing wasn't sophisticated enough? What if he made mistakes? What if everyone could tell he was just the school custodian trying to be something he wasn't? These worries kept David awake at night. During the day, while he cleaned classrooms and hallways, his mind would wander to the upcoming performance. He found himself imagining all the ways things could go wrong. What if he forgot the music in the middle of a piece? What if his hands shook so badly from nerves that he couldn't play at all? What if people laughed or, worse, just looked embarrassed? For him, the doubts were especially strong during the third week of preparation. David's playing had improved dramatically, but he was acutely aware of his limitations. Professional pianists practiced for hours every day for years to maintain their skill level. He was trying to prepare for an important performance with just 3 weeks of evening practice after a 3-year break from music. One evening, as he struggled through a particularly difficult passage in the Chopin piece, David stopped playing and put his head in his hands. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly, more to himself than to his daughter, but his daughter had been listening, and she immediately got up from her homework and walked over to the piano bench. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "I'm scared," David admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if people think I don't belong up there playing for them? What if I embarrass you and embarrass the school?" His daughter was quiet for a moment, thinking about what her father had said. Then she spoke with the kind of wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children. "Dad, do you remember what you told me about that night music? You said it was supposed to make people feel peaceful and happy, right?" David nodded. "Well, when you play it, that's exactly how it makes me feel, peaceful and happy. And I think that's what matters most." She paused, then continued. "Besides, you're not doing this to show off or to prove you're better than anyone else. You're doing it to help save music class for all the kids at school. That's a good reason to be brave." David looked at his daughter's earnest face and felt some of his anxiety begin to ease. She was right, of course. This wasn't about him proving he was a great pianist. This was about contributing something meaningful to help preserve arts education for children who deserved the same opportunities he had been given when he was young. "You're pretty smart, you know that?" David said, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I get it from my dad," she replied with a grin. That night, David practiced with renewed focus. Instead of worrying about what people might think, he concentrated on the music itself, on bringing out the beauty in each phrase, on expressing the emotions that the composers had written into these timeless pieces. His daughter was right. The point wasn't to be perfect. The point was to share something beautiful and meaningful with people who cared about the same things he cared about. And if he could do that, then maybe his performance would be exactly what it needed to be. The day of the fundraising gala arrived with a crisp spring evening that felt full of possibility. David had barely slept the night before, his mind cycling through the pieces he would perform and all the things that could go wrong. But when he woke up that morning and saw his daughter's excited face at breakfast, some of his nervousness transformed into determination. "Tonight's the big night, Dad," she said, bouncing in her chair as she ate her cereal. "I can't wait to see you play. For everyone. I told my teacher yesterday that my dad was going to be in the show, and she said that was really special." David smiled, though his stomach was still doing flip-flops. "Are you sure you want to sit in the front row? You might be more comfortable. In the back where it's not so scary." "No way," his daughter said firmly. "I want to be right where I can see your hands on the piano. I've been watching you practice for 3 weeks, and tonight I get to watch you perform for real." The school day passed in a blur for David. He went through his regular custodial duties, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he passed by the music room, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Tonight, that piano wouldn't just be a piece of furniture he cleaned around. It would be his partner in creating something beautiful for an audience of people who mattered to his community. Around 4 o'clock, David realized he needed to go home and get ready. He had never thought much about what to wear to something like this. His wardrobe consisted mainly of work clothes and casual outfits for weekends. The only formal clothing he owned was a black suit that he had bought for his wife's funeral 3 years ago. As David stood in front of his bedroom mirror adjusting his tie, memories of his wife flooded back. She had always been his biggest supporter when it came to music. She used to say that watching him play piano was like watching someone speak a language that came straight from the heart. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," David whispered to the empty room, touching the wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. "I hope this would make you proud?" His daughter appeared in the doorway, wearing her best dress, a navy blue one with small flowers that they had bought for school picture day. "Dad, you look really handsome," she said, "like a real piano player." "I am a real piano player," David said, surprised by his own words. For the first time in years, he actually felt like that statement was true. They arrived at the school an hour before the event was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was already filling up with cars much nicer than David's old sedan. Through the windows of the school, he could see people in elegant clothes setting up decorations and arranging tables for the silent auction. Mrs. Henderson spotted them as they entered through the main doors. She was wearing a beautiful emerald green dress and looked every inch the professional educator. But her smile was warm and genuine when she saw David. "There's our star performer," she said, walking over to greet them. "How are you feeling, David?" "Nervous," David admitted, "but ready, I think." "Good. Nervous energy can actually help with a performance as long as you don't let it overwhelm you." Mrs. Henderson knelt down to David's daughter's level. "And you must be our special audience member. Your dad has been working so hard to prepare for tonight." "I know," his daughter said proudly. "I've been his helper. I listened to him practice every single night." As more people began arriving, David started to feel the weight of what he was about to do. These weren't just random strangers. These were parents of children he saw every day at school, teachers who had always known him only as the custodian, school board members who made important decisions about funding and programs. He watched as families found their seats in the decorated gymnasium. The room had been transformed with tablecloths, flowers, and soft lighting that made everything look elegant and special. At the front of the room, the piano had been moved from the music room and positioned on a small stage area. David's daughter tugged on his hand. "Dad, let's go find our seats. I want to sit right in front where I promised." As they made their way toward the front row, David noticed people looking at him with curiosity. He could almost hear their thoughts. "Isn't that the janitor? What's he doing here dressed up like that?" Some faces showed recognition, others confusion. A few people smiled politely. But David could sense their uncertainty about why he was there. The evening began with welcome remarks from Mrs. Henderson, followed by the children's choir performing songs from popular movies. David watched from his front row seat, trying to calm his racing heart as his performance time approached. His daughter sat beside him, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand reassuringly. Next came the fourth-grade play, which was both charming and chaotic, in the way that children's performances always are. The audience laughed and applauded enthusiastically, and David found himself relaxing slightly as he watched the kids on stage having so much fun. Then came the parent performances. A mother who was apparently a semi-professional magician performed some impressive tricks that had everyone clapping. A father told jokes that had the audience laughing so hard that some people wiped tears from their eyes. A group of parents performed a short comedy sketch about the challenges of helping kids with modern homework. David's hands began to sweat as his turn approached. Mrs. Henderson stepped up to the microphone to introduce the classical music segment. Our next performer is someone who has been a valuable member of our school community for 3 years, she began. Many of you know David as the person who keeps our school clean and beautiful every day. What you might not know is that David has a background in classical piano performance, and when we needed someone to fill our classical music slot, he graciously volunteered to help. Please welcome David, performing 2 classical pieces for us tonight. The applause was polite but uncertain. David could feel the audience's surprise and curiosity as he stood up from his seat. His daughter squeezed his hand one more time and whispered, "You've got this, Dad. Just play like you do for me." As David walked toward the piano, his legs felt unsteady. The stage area suddenly seemed enormous, and the piano looked both familiar and foreign at the same time. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, could sense the mixture of anticipation and skepticism in the room. David sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it to the right height. He placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath, trying to center himself the way he had learned to do during his college years. For just a moment, he looked out at the audience and found his daughter's face in the front row. She was beaming at him with such pure confidence and love that everything else seemed to fade away. This was it. 3 weeks of preparation, years of buried dreams, and a lifetime of loving music had led to this single moment. David closed his eyes, thought of his wife's encouraging words from long ago, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the gymnasium with a gentleness that seemed to surprise everyone in the room. David's fingers found their way to the familiar melody as if no time had passed at all. The sound was pure and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of shuffling programs and whispered conversations. Within moments, something magical began to happen. The casual chatter that had filled the room during the previous performances gradually died away. People stopped looking at their phones. Parents who had been checking the time or thinking about weekend plans found themselves drawn into the music despite themselves. David felt the change in the room's energy, and it gave him confidence. His 3 weeks of practice had prepared him. Well, but more than that, his years of loving this music came flooding back. His left hand provided a steady, gentle accompaniment, while his right hand sang the melody with a tenderness that spoke of deep understanding and genuine emotion. As he played, David forgot about being nervous. He forgot about the audience's expectations and his own fears of not being good enough. The music took over, transporting him back to a time when creating beauty was the most natural thing in the world. His fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence, and the melody soared through the room like something alive. In the front row, his daughter sat transfixed. She had heard this piece many times during their practice sessions, but hearing it performed for an audience was completely different. Her father looked transformed at the piano, no longer the tired custodian who came home exhausted every evening, but an artist sharing something precious with the world. Throughout the audience, people began to have their own reactions to the music. Mrs. Peterson, a third-grade teacher, found herself thinking about her own grandmother, who used to play piano in their small-town church. Mr. Williams, a school board member who had been skeptical about funding for arts education, suddenly understood why music mattered so much to children's development. In the back of the room, Maria Santos, whose son was in second grade, wiped a tear from her eye. She had been working 2 jobs to make ends meet since her divorce, and she rarely had time to appreciate beautiful things anymore. But this music reminded her that beauty still existed in the world, even during difficult times. The Chopin piece lasted about 4 minutes, but it felt both eternal and fleeting at the same time. As David played the final, gentle notes, the silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the empty silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the full silence of people who had just been deeply moved and needed a moment to process what they had experienced. Then the applause began, but it wasn't the polite, expected clapping that had followed the other performances. This was genuine appreciation, the kind of applause that comes from people who have just witnessed something truly special. Several people were wiping their eyes, and many were shaking their heads in amazement. David looked up from the piano keys, slightly dazed by what had just happened. The transformation in the room was visible. People were looking at him differently now, not with curiosity or skepticism, but with respect and admiration. More importantly, they were looking at him like he belonged exactly where he was sitting, but David wasn't finished. He had prepared 2 pieces for the evening, and he could feel that the audience was ready for more. Without speaking, he positioned his hands for the second piece, a gentle waltz that showcased a different side of his musical abilities. If the Chopin had been introspective and peaceful, the waltz was joyful and dancing. David's training in classical technique became more apparent as he navigated the piece's technical challenges with surprising grace. His hands moved independently, creating complex harmonies and rhythms that demonstrated years of serious musical study. This piece told a different story. Where the nocturne had been about quiet contemplation, the waltz was about celebration and life's simple pleasures. David found himself smiling as he played, remembering the joy that music had always brought him. He thought about his wife, who had loved to dance, and about his daughter, who was discovering the magic of music for the first time. The audience was completely engaged now. Children who had been restless during earlier parts of the program sat perfectly still, mesmerized by the sounds coming from the piano. Adults found themselves swaying slightly to the rhythm, caught up in the infectious joy of the music. As David played, he realized something profound was happening. This wasn't just about him performing for an audience anymore. This was about a community coming together around something beautiful and meaningful. These people, teachers, parents, school board members, local business owners, were all sharing this moment of artistic expression, and it was changing how they saw each other and themselves. When the waltz came to its spirited conclusion, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. People jumped to their feet, giving David a standing ovation that seemed to surprise everyone, including David himself. The sound of clapping filled the gymnasium, but underneath it, David could hear something else. Genuine appreciation and respect. As the applause continued, David's daughter couldn't contain herself any longer. She broke from her front row seat and ran onto the stage area, throwing her arms around her father while he was still sitting at the piano bench. The audience's response to this spontaneous display of love and pride was immediate. The applause grew even louder, and more people found themselves wiping away tears. "Dad, that was incredible," his daughter whispered in his ear, loud enough for the nearby microphone to pick up. "You were amazing." David hugged his daughter tightly, feeling overwhelmed by the moment. As he looked out at the standing audience, he saw faces that told a story of transformation. Mrs. Henderson was beaming with pride. Several school board members were applauding with obvious enthusiasm. Parents who had never spoken to him before were looking at him with new respect and appreciation, but the real transformation was happening inside David himself. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He wasn't just the custodian anymore, and he wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. He was simply a man who loved music, sharing that love with a community that had embraced him completely. As the applause finally began to die down, Mrs. Henderson approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice filled with emotion, I think we've all just witnessed something truly special. David, thank you for reminding us why arts education matters so much, and for showing us that talent and beauty can be found in the most unexpected places. The evening continued with the silent auction and other fundraising activities, but the mood had changed completely. People approached David throughout the rest of the night, thanking him for his performance and asking about his musical background. Children who had never paid attention to him before now looked at him with wonder and excitement. More importantly, the fundraising totals exceeded all expectations. By the end of the evening, enough money had been raised not only to save the existing arts programs but to expand them. David's performance had reminded everyone in attendance why music and arts education were worth fighting for. As David and his daughter finally headed home that night, she looked up at him with sleepy but proud eyes. Dad, she said, I always knew you were special, but now everyone else knows it too. David smiled, thinking about his wife's final wish for him to return to music someday. That someday had finally arrived, and it had been even more beautiful than he could have imagined. He had given his community a gift, but they had given him something even more valuable in return. The knowledge that his dreams and his practical responsibilities didn't have to be separate things. Sometimes, if you're brave enough to try, they can come together in ways that transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you.